In Canada, how much force are police allowed to use before it becomes excessive use of force? Are police in Canada allowed to put their knee on someone's neck while effecting an arrest? I'm going to take a look at these questions on today's episode of Don't Talk TV. Hello, my name is Nicholas Wansbutter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer in Stratford, Ontario, Canada, and welcome to Don't Talk TV. The question of police brutality and what constitutes excessive use of force in Canadian law came up last week when, on June the 10th, 2021, a viewer shared with me a video from Montreal of a 14-year-old young black man being arrested by two members of Montreal police in a maneuver eerily reminiscent of the arrest of George Floyd. Now, of course, this young man, as far as I know, didn't suffer any injuries and certainly didn't die, but it still raises very serious questions about what is allowed under Canadian law when it comes to the use of force to effect an arrest. So first, let's take a look at the video I'm talking about, then we'll cover the law, then I'll have a discussion on how that law might be applied to this particular case. So we have here a videotaped by a person named France Benjamin, and I just downloaded this off YouTube without Mr. Benjamin's permission, but I hope he's okay with that. You can see here right from the very beginning, this young man has his face down on the concrete just to left of the officer's knee. The officer gets up, rolls him onto his side, and then puts his knee back on his neck again. You can see this young man, he's just laying there passively. He's not moving, he's not doing anything. Another eerily reminiscent similarity to the George Floyd arrest. Now, this isn't 9 minutes, but you can see this is still a prolonged situation here. And again, you've got police standing, eyeballing the bystanders who are concerned about this and watching it unfold. So here the officer gets off of him a second time. Rolling him around a bit. Puts him onto his stomach and now kneeling on his upper back area. And that's all the video footage we have. Now, we don't have any video of what led up to this, whether this person had weapons or police believed him to have weapons, whether he was resisting police beforehand, but what we see in the video is a completely passive young man laying on the ground while this officer's kneeling on his neck and on his back. Now, so that brings up that question, are police allowed to do this? Before we get into the law, let's look at what the employer of these officers has to say. So I have here an article from CBC from June the 18th entitled "Montreal Police Filmed Kneeling on Black Teen's Neck, Prompting Calls for Investigation." But then look at the subtitle here, "Neck Kneeling Not Prohibited by City Police Service, but Montreal Mayor Seeking Answers About Incident." If we just scroll down here near the bottom of the article, they talk about here, "Kneeling on neck not against rules. Kneeling on a suspect's neck is not prohibited by SPVM, says Stéphane Wall, a former sergeant and training instructor. The technique is used to force a suspect to surrender, but has to be quick, he said. As of the filming of this episode, no charges have been laid against these officers, and frankly, I'll be surprised if anything happens to these officers, and if it does, it'll be only because of the media and political pressure, and otherwise it wouldn't. And I base that upon the law and on personal experience, especially in Ontario with the Special Investigations Unit, who, with all due respect, in my personal opinion, almost never ever charge officers, even when I think they should. But let's take a look at the law. First case we're going to take a look at here is a 2010 decision of the Superior Court of Canada, Her Majesty the Queen and Lyle Marcellus Nasagalluaq. in short referred to as Her Majesty the Queen and Nassau-Galawak. The most important part of this decision for our purposes starts at paragraph 32, where the Supreme Court discusses the legal standard to be applied when assessing the issue of excessive force. So as the court says in the highlighted section here, police officers do not have an unlimited power to inflict harm on a person in the course of their duties. While at times the police may have to resort to force in order to complete an arrest or prevent an offender from escaping police custody, the allowable degree of force to be used remains constrained by the principles of proportionality, necessity, and reasonableness. And you may remember those terms from my discussions of self-defense law, because those are requirements for self-defense as well. Courts must guard against the illegitimate use of power by the police against members of our society, given its grave consequences. The legal constraint on a police officer's use of force are deeply rooted in our common law tradition and are enshrined in the criminal code, specifically section 25. We go a bit further here at paragraph 34, it says section 25 essentially provides that a police officer is justified in using force to effect a lawful arrest, provided that he or she acted on reasonable and probable grounds and used only as much force as was necessary in the circumstances. That is not the end of the matter. Section 25 sub 3 also prohibits a police officer from using a greater degree of force, i.e. that which is intended or likely to cause death or grievous bodily harm, unless he or she believes that it is necessary to protect him or herself or another person under his or her protection from death or grievous bodily harm. The officer's belief must be objectively reasonable. So that all sounds quite good, but here's the key part that, in my experience, is used all the time to give police broad latitude. This is like the get out of jail free card here. Set paragraph 35. Police action should not be judged against a standard of perfection. It must be remembered that the police engage in dangerous and demanding work and often have to react quickly to emergencies. Their actions should be judged in light of these exigent circumstances. I call that a get out of jail free card just because I see that used all the time, and the reference to the exigent circumstances, the unpredictable circumstances, the dynamic circumstances, and the dangerousness of the police job, which in and of itself I think is fair. No one should be judged against a standard of perfection because no human being is perfect. What I object to is the fact that it seems that civilians are not accorded the same leeway or the same benefit of the doubt. It makes no sense to me why individuals who are trained in how to deal with these intense situations are given more latitude and more benefit of the doubt than a civilian who doesn't have training and therefore you'd think would have a harder time knowing what to do. Yet it seems that police get much more benefit of the doubt than civilians do. The next case I want to look at is a 2008 decision of the Ontario Court of Appeal, Her Majesty the Queen and Francis Andre Walcott, or Her Majesty the Queen and Walcott. This was a case of a man who was tasered a number of times by police while they were effecting an arrest. And I would just note here, Nassau-Galawak mentions this as well, but in this case it outlines sections 7 and 12 being the pertinent charter sections that protect people against police brutality, section 7 being the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, and section 12 being the right not to be subjected to any cruel and unusual treatment or punishment. Starting at paragraph 24, the case of Walcott gives a useful discussion of the factors to be considered in assessing the reasonableness or necessity of the force used in any particular situation, and notes that the court must take into account all the circumstances, including whether 1. The suspect was acting in a hostile manner towards the police, resisting arrest or failing to comply with an officer's arrest procedure, 2. The relative sizes and weights of the officer and suspect, 3. Whether the officer was at risk of harm, 4. Whether the police knew the suspect had a history which might represent a threat to them, or 5. The police understood that weapons might be on the premises. So let's take a look at those factors in relation to this video, and was it necessary, proportionate, and reasonable for that officer to be continually kneeling on that young man's neck the way he was? So taking those considerations outlined in Walcott, 1. Was the suspect acting in a hostile manner? Again, we can't see what led up to this video, but at the time of the video, he's completely passive, laying on the ground. He's not offering any resistance and not acting in a hostile manner at all. So that consideration would weigh against the police and suggest that the use of force is excessive. 2, the relative sizes and weights of the people involved. It's a bit difficult to see from this video, but that young man being 14 years old, he appears to be smaller than the officer. I suspect that he is quite a bit smaller than the officer, and a grown adult man is going to have more muscle mass. Certainly a police officer who trains is going to have more muscle than a 14-year-old boy. So again, that one, and there's 2 officers versus this one 14-year-old boy. That factor would again weigh against the reasonableness of the force being used here. 3rd, whether the officer was at risk of harm. Just going by the video, there's nothing to suggest there's any risk to the officer. And the video is the most pertinent part. I mean, at the time that he's kneeling on this young man's neck, that boy's hands are handcuffed behind his back and he's just laying passively. There is no danger to this officer and no apparent justification for kneeling on his neck like that. 4 and 5, whether police knew this suspect had a history of violence, and whether police believed weapons to be on the premises. We have no way of knowing that from the video, but given the passive acquiescence of this boy, and given that he's only 14, I find it hard to believe that he'd have a bad enough criminal record to justify this sort of action on the part of the police. So looking at the law, it would seem that excessive force is being used, which is not only a violation of this boy's Section 7 and 12 rights under the Charter, it also constitutes an assault. Now, again, will these officers be charged? I would be surprised if they are, because we already have it from people within the Montreal Police that this is an approved technique, which is interesting. I watched a fair bit of the Derek Chauvin trial in Minneapolis, and the line of police and other expert witnesses lining up to say that knee on neck is never approved, and Mr. Chauvin was completely out of line in using that. Now we see another police force saying that it is acceptable, which would seem to back up some of the defense witnesses on the Chauvin case saying, no, this actually is accepted, and Derek Chauvin was taught to use this technique, and he's now just being thrown under the bus because of political pressure. That aside, I suspect that most people would agree that kneeling on people's necks shouldn't be an approved technique for police. Granted, I've never been a police officer, but just as a regular person, I don't really see how that's a safe and effective technique when they have other techniques and options available to them. But in Canada, police seem to get an awful lot of latitude, as I've alluded to earlier. I frankly don't know for a certainty that if the George Floyd death had occurred in Canada, and Derek Chauvin had been a Canadian police officer, I don't know for sure that he would have been charged or that he would have been convicted. That said, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. This video is not legal advice. If you are in a situation where you need legal advice, call a lawyer. Call myself or another lawyer. My 1-855 number and my website are listed below. If you have any other ideas of show topics you'd like to see me cover, please leave a comment in the comment section below or email me at the email address listed. And if you found this video helpful or informative, please consider liking, sharing, subscribing, and following me on social media.